How far can a man's faith go? On Mount Moriah, Abraham faced the most challenging test of his life, sacrificing his own son. A story of obedience, pain, and divine provision that changed the course of faith. Discover what happened in this decisive moment. The desert was silent except for the whisper of the wind sweeping the grains of sand like memories lost in time. Abraham, with his eyes fixed on the sky, contemplated the countless stars shining like divine promises. Each point of light seemed to whisper to him the covenant made with God, a lineage as numerous as the stars and the sand of the sea. Beside him a fire crackled softly, but it did not warm the unease that filled his heart that night. He thought of Isaac, his only son, born to Sarah when all odds seemed impossible. Isaac's laughter was the soundtrack of his old age, and each day with him was a living reminder of God's faithfulness. Abraham closed his eyes and murmured a prayer of gratitude, trying to push away the feeling that something was about to change. Then it happened. An invisible presence took over the place, and the world around seemed to hold its breath. The wind ceased, and the silence became dense, almost tangible. The voice came deep and undeniable, resonating in his soul more than in his ears. Abraham. He opened his eyes, feeling the weight of the call. He responded immediately with reverence and fear. "Here I am." The voice continued without hesitation, but laden with a meaning Abraham did not fully understand. "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will show you." The world seemed to collapse on him. For a moment the silence returned, now as an overwhelming void. Abraham tried to organize his thoughts, but the divine command echoed relentlessly in his mind. Sacrifice Isaac, the promised son, the heir of his lineage. His heart screamed in protest, but his soul knew the voice was God's. He could not question it. Abraham fell to his knees, his body trembling as hot tears streamed down his face. He did not know if he was crying from pain, fear, or the weight of obedience. All he could do was pray, seeking strength to comprehend the incomprehensible. The night passed slowly, but Abraham remained motionless, staring at the embers of the fire that now seemed only a pale reflection of the fire consuming his heart. When he finally rose, he knew there was no choice. His faith would be tested, and the price would be high. Abraham entered the tent where Isaac was sleeping peacefully. He looked at his son's serene face, and something inside him broke. Nevertheless, he took a deep breath. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of their journey to Mount Moriah, and he would do what needed to be done. The sun had barely risen when Abraham began preparing for the journey. He saddled the donkey, set aside the wood for the sacrifice, and called 2 servants to accompany him. With a crushing weight in his heart, he woke Isaac. The young man, full of energy and confidence, gladly accepted the invitation to join his father. For him, it was just another journey, perhaps a pilgrimage in honor of God. Isaac did not notice the shadow hanging over Abraham's countenance. The first stage of the journey was marked by silence. The desert, with its infinite emptiness, reflected what Abraham felt inside. Each step seemed to weigh a ton, as though the ground beneath his feet demanded an extraordinary effort to be conquered. The servants spoke in low tones, but Abraham heard only the echo of God's words in his mind. "Father," Isaac's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. "Where are we going?" Abraham looked at his son and forced a smile. "To a place that God will show us," he replied, with a calmness he did not feel. Isaac accepted the answer without questioning, but the question lingered in the air like a constant reminder of what was to come. At night, when they stopped to rest, Isaac lay close to the fire, and Abraham stayed a little further away. He could not sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he was tormented by visions. He saw the altar, the cold stones stained with blood. He saw Isaac's face, confused and frightened. He felt the weight of the knife in his hand, the cutting silence before the sacrifice. He woke up startled, sweating cold, but tried to maintain his composure in front of Isaac and the servants. On the second day, the silence between them grew heavier. Abraham began to notice that Isaac was observing him differently, as if sensing something was not right. "Father," Isaac asked again, hesitantly this time, "we have the wood and the fire, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" Abraham swallowed hard. He knew this question would come, but hearing it still felt like a blade piercing his heart. He answered the only way he could, with a faith he desperately tried to sustain. "God will provide the lamb, my son." Isaac seemed satisfied with the answer, but the tone in his voice left Abraham with the feeling that the boy was beginning to suspect. Still, the young man continued the journey with the same vigor, without asking more questions. On the morning of the third day, Abraham saw Mount Moriah in the distance. His legs wavered for a moment, but he steadied himself, took a deep breath, and turned to the servants. "Stay here with the donkey," he said. "The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will return to you." Those words, spoken with conviction, were almost a prayer. He wanted to believe they would return together, but he knew what God had asked of him. Abraham and Isaac took the wood and the fire and began to climb the mountain. The narrow, steep path seemed a metaphor for the weight of the decision Abraham carried. As they walked, Abraham looked to the sky, seeking a sign, a word, anything to ease the burden on his heart. But the sky remained silent, as vast and distant as it had seemed that first night. The climb was slow, each step harder than the last. Abraham felt that time was against him, yet the journey was nearing its end. The silence between father and son was now deafening. Both knew something significant was about to happen, but only Abraham knew the full extent of the sacrifice to come. When they reached the top of Mount Moriah, the wind blew fiercely, howling between the rocks as if the very environment bore witness to the tension in the air. Abraham stopped for a moment, looking around. He knew this was the place. Every fiber of his being wanted to retreat, but his spirit urged him forward. Faithful to the voice he had heard days be, "Isaac," he said, his voice trembling, "help me build the altar." The young man obeyed without hesitation, gathering stones from around and carefully stacking them. He seemed unaware of the emotional storm consuming his father, but his movements were slower, almost hesitant, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Abraham watched every gesture of his son, engraving those moments in his memory, knowing they might be the last. When the altar was ready, Abraham placed the wood on top, forming the base for the sacrifice. Isaac stood silently, now more attentive, as if he was beginning to understand that something was amiss. "Father," he called, his voice filled with uncertainty, "the altar is ready. But where is the lamb?" Abraham paused, taking a deep breath, and turned to his son. His heart felt as though it would burst in his chest, but he could not let his pain show. He placed his hands on Isaac's shoulders, looking into his eyes with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "My son, God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering." For a moment the silence between them was absolute. Abraham knew those words were true, but he had no certainty about how God's provision would manifest. He feared that the lamb was Isaac himself. When the moment came, Abraham could not stop the tear that rolled down his cheek. He explained to Isaac what needed to be done, his voice trembling as if it no longer belonged to him. Isaac, initially shocked, tried to understand. He trusted his father's character and God's faithfulness, but the terror of the unknown filled his heart. Even so, he did not resist. Abraham bound Isaac's hands and feet, his mind battling every movement he made. He laid his son on the altar on the wood. The wind seemed stronger now, whistling in his ears like an accusation. He looked to the sky one last time, desperately seeking a sign, but found only emptiness. God, please, he murmured as his hands gripped the knife. His fingers trembled, the blade reflecting the pale glow of the sun. He raised his arm, his heart screaming in pain and despair. At that moment, everything seemed to stop. The wind, time, even Abraham's breath. Abraham! Abraham! The voice cut through the silence like thunder, reverberating in the air and in Abraham's heart. He stopped immediately, the knife still in the air, and responded with a tearful cry. "Here I am." The voice continued, now full of mercy and authority. "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham let the knife fall to the ground and collapsed to his knees, sobbing with relief and gratitude. He leaned over Isaac, untying him with trembling hands, and embraced him with all his strength. Father and son stayed there together, crying, one from trauma, the other from faith, tested to its limits. As they recovered, Abraham heard a sound in the distance. He lifted his head and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. The glimmer of hope in his eyes seemed to reflect the very relief of heaven. God had provided the lamb. Abraham stood, helped Isaac down from the altar, and approached the animal. Carefully, he brought the ram to the altar and sacrificed it as a burnt offering to God, murmuring a prayer of gratitude. The place, which had been a stage of emotional terror, now transformed into a symbol of obedience and divine provision. He called the place, "The Lord Will Provide," for he understood that God would always honor his promises, even when all seemed lost. Isaac, still shaken, watched in silence, trying to process what had just happened. The trauma of the moment was etched in his memory, but something deeper began to grow in his heart. An understanding of his father's unwavering faith. When the sacrifice was finished, the wind finally ceased and the mountain fell silent once more, but this time it was not an empty silence. It was a silence of peace, relief, and renewal. As the sacrifice burned on the altar, a mysterious tranquility enveloped Mount Moriah. The sound of the wind had vanished, replaced by a profound, almost sacred quiet. Abraham and Isaac stood near, the altar saying nothing, but their hearts were filled with conflicting emotions. Abraham looked to the heavens once more, this time not seeking a sign, but offering thanks. He knew that God had provided, that the test was complete, yet the weight of what had nearly occurred lingered in his heart. His hands still trembled at the thought of the moment he had raised the knife over his son. Isaac, on the other hand, watched the fire consuming the ram. His eyes reflected both innocence and confusion, as someone who had just witnessed something extraordinary, yet incomprehensible. He knew God was real and powerful, but he was still trying to understand why his father had almost sacrificed him. Despite his fear, a seed of faith began to grow within him. "Father," Isaac finally broke the silence, his voice hesitant, "why did God ask for something so terrible? Am I really that important to him?" Abraham approached, sitting beside his son. His eyes were full of compassion, and he placed a hand on Isaac's shoulder. "My son, what God asks of us doesn't always make sense to us, but he is faithful and always fulfills his promises. Today, he showed us that we can trust him, even when everything seems lost." Isaac remained silent, pondering his father's words. Abraham knew it wouldn't be easy for the young man to understand everything immediately, but he believed that in time, Isaac would see the event as a milestone of faith, just as he did. As the fire died out, Abraham began to dismantle the altar, returning the stones to the ground. He knew that Mount Moriah would not only be a place of remembrance for him and Isaac, but also for generations to come. He looked to the horizon, to the vast blue sky that now seemed more welcoming, as if reconciled with what had just occurred. "Let's go, my son," he said with a lighter tone in his voice. "It's time to go home. The two began their descent from the mountain in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The path seemed easier than the climb, as though the weight they had carried before had been lifted from their shoulders. Abraham couldn't stop thinking about God's goodness, who in his infinite wisdom provided a substitute for the sacrifice. When they approached the place where the servants were waiting, Abraham noticed their curious looks. They likely had many questions, but Abraham knew he couldn't explain everything. Some things could only be understood by those who had lived. Then Abraham and Isaac mounted the donkey, and the small group began their journey back home. Along the way, Isaac watched his father with a new perspective. He no longer saw just an old and wise man, but someone whose faith was unshakable, even in the face of the impossible. Abraham, for his part, couldn't stop thinking about the promise God had made, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. He knew that by sparing Isaac, God was reaffirming his words. The sacrifice was not about loss, but about trust and divine love. As the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and red, Abraham looked at Isaac and smiled. He knew this experience would not only leave them with painful memories, but also with the certainty that the Lord would always provide. The way back felt shorter, but the silence between Abraham and Isaac carried a weight that could not be ignored. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape as the two traveled side by side. Abraham, still deep in thought, occasionally glanced at Isaac, who seemed lost in his own mind. Both knew that what had happened on Mount Moriah would mark them forever. When they finally arrived home, Sarah greeted them with a mixture of relief and concern. She could tell something significant had occurred, but chose not to ask immediately. Abraham reassured her with a smile and simply said, "God is good, and he took care of us." That night, as Isaac slept, Abraham went outside to gaze at the stars. He remembered the promise God had made so many years ago, that his descendants would be as countless as those points of light in the sky. Now, more than ever, he believed it. God had powerfully reaffirmed his covenant. Abraham took a deep breath and closed his eyes. The weight of the journey still lingered, but he felt a peace that could only come from God. He knew that no matter what the future held, the Lord would always provide. And so, on Mount Moriah, Abraham left us an eternal example of faith and trust in God, even in the most challenging moments. If this story moved you, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And of course, subscribe to the channel for more inspiring and transformative Bible stories. See you next time.